right. Thank you for checking in this week's Realtors Tip podcast. This is Adam Ashba on Real Estate Real Podcast. I am your host, and we had a message from a viewer about more information about what earnest money is and how that affects them in the home buying process. So stay with us on this week's Realtors Tip. Well, earnest money. What is it? How does it affect you as the buyer? We had a listener, viewer, who was an agent who asked the question about earnest money. They were a newer agent. They didn't understand what it was. Is it important? Should they have their clients provide earnest money when they purchase a home? So let's talk a little bit at first about what earnest money is. Earnest money is basically a deposit, possibly refundable, when you purchase a home. And the metaphor that I usually use at the brokerage is, think of it like it's a tip when you go to a restaurant and you want to, the waitress or waiter brings out the food and you eat it and you get your bill. If you don't tip, it's kind of crappy if you don't, right? But it's not against the law if you don't, but you really should. It just shows that you mean business, you're very interested in the property. Now, earnest money is in the form of a check that is given to the agent from the buyer. Now, in our market, earnest money checks are held with the buyer's agent. Now, with the letter of the law, with the Division of Real Estate here in Ohio, it basically says the earnest money check will be held to whoever was stated in the contract. Now, again, in our market, the earnest money is held by the buyer's agent. However, if a seller requires the buyer that they hold onto that check personally in their own personal bank account, which I'm talking about the seller's personal bank account, if all parties agree, then that's okay. It doesn't have to be held by the buyer's agent, but it's just typical that that's the way it's handled. Now, earnest money, I've only had a few times in my real estate career that a buyer has lost their earnest money. Now, how can a buyer lose their earnest money? Well, a few things. Usually, and again, I want to preface, I'm not an attorney. If you want to consult with an attorney about legal matters, please do that. I'm just a real estate broker, but ways that someone could lose their earnest money is basically if they're canceling a purchase of a home for something outside of their contract. I had one situation, thank goodness it wasn't on our brokerage, but through a friend who was an agent, their buyer that was buying a property, actually the night before they purchased, the couple broke up. And obviously that was for personal reasons. That wasn't the seller's issue. And nowhere in the contract they said they'd buy their house contingent if the couple broke up. So guess what? They lost their earnest money. Usually factors that are personal factors, or the person just got cold feet at the last minute. Within our brokerage, we always write our contracts contingent on inspection of the property and finance. Those are two things that we, as agents at my brokerage, that we train our agents to put in their contracts to help protect the buyer. And when I say that, when I reference contingent on inspection, which means buyers have the right to inspect the property. Okay, now I know they go out and take a look at it with the agent initially, but they have a right within a certain time window to get the house inspected with an inspector, just to make sure they're getting what they think they're getting. And if they're not getting what they thought they were getting, if that makes sense, then they have a right to cancel the contract and get that earnest money back. Okay. The second way that we do, and we educate our agents at the brokerage, is contingent on financing. So, for example, if you have a buyer that loves a house, they get it inspected, everything's great. However, the bank says, hey, listen, I'm sorry, we can't give you that money to buy that house like we talked about. Well, that's not the buyer's fault. They intended to buy the home, but the bank said no, which means then they have a right to get their earnest money back. Okay. Next question to piggyback on that is, well, how much typically is earnest money? Like, what's the dollar amount that my buyer should give to the seller? Well, there's no rules, or there's no, basically I always call it like rule of thumb. Some people will say, well, 1%. So if you buy a house for $300,000, 1% of $300,000 is $3,000. Now, in our market, and pretty typical in the Midwest, I've seen anywhere from about $500 for a smaller home, up to $2,000 or $3,000 for an average $300,000 house. The seller can request whatever they want as a earnest money deposit. Okay, so if a seller says, "Hey, I want to only, I want the buyer to give a $3,000 to $4,000 earnest money deposit," they have every right to ask for that. Doesn't mean they're going to get it. That's something you might have to negotiate in the contract. Another key point on earnest money is the earnest money is given at different times during the process. Typically, we would do one of two ways. One is once you go into like a handshake agreement between the buyer and seller at the very beginning of the process, that's when the buyer would turn over their earnest money check to the agent. Okay, or the second option is they will then give their earnest money check after they have inspected the property and they've agreed that they do want to continue pursuing it even after their inspection. There's no right or wrong reason. Not one's better than the other. But those are kind of the two typical options within our market. With that being said, if you have any other questions about earnest money, please let me know. This is a great topic. Again, with earnest money, you don't have to give it up as a buyer. It's kind of courtesy. It shows that you're super interested and taken serious. And if you don't offer earnest money, then the seller has every right to ask you for it, and it might be more than you want to give. So a lot of times I tell my buyer's agent, please, request, be the first to bear gifts than the opposite. So if you have any other questions like this, please hit me up below in the comment section. Like and subscribe if you're getting a lot of great content. If you have any other questions, again, just hit it in the comments and we'll cover it next week. Again, this is Adam Ashba. Thanks for listening to this podcast, Real Estate Real. Check us out on Facebook, Spotify, iTunes. We're out there. Let all your family and friends know. And we're glad to keep on pushing out some really good content and make our industry better. Again, this is Adam Ashba. See you next time.